Let's learn how to read the Bible together. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll know how to read the Bible better, and you'll have some essential Bible study skills developed through this Bible study walkthrough. We're in Hebrews chapter 1, and so I'm going to do my best to explain what's going on and hopefully address certain tips and skills along the way. And if you didn't know, we have a free 40-day Bible study program, a free 27-day, and a free 11-day program linked in the description below, as well as on our website, abovereproachministry.com. But right here, Hebrews chapter 1, apologize for my voice, starting in verse 1, it says, long ago. In other words, this already, and I want you to pay attention to when you read the Bible, notice any kind of, I'm gonna list it out for you here. I'm going to call it time markers. Anything that references an amount of time. So what we have here is a long ago referencing that what's about to take place or be said has to do with long ago. At many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, okay? Now, if you didn't catch that already in verse 1, when you read the Bible, it's helpful to circle, highlight, make note of any kind of repeating words you see in a single verse, in a number of verses, in the same paragraph, wherever it is. This lets me know, right? There's a lot of ways and many times that God has actually spoken specifically to our fathers, the author of Hebrews says, by the prophets, okay? So specifically, again, there's two things I want you to notice. When you read the Bible, notice any kind of time markers that will help you contextualize and rightly interpret the text of Scripture and what's being said, right? But also pay attention to repeating ideas and words such as right here, the emphasis on the fact that many times and in many different ways, God spoke. In other words, we are not without God speaking throughout human history. He did it a lot. He did it in a variety of ways. This notes the many. The variety of God's, I'll put variety and I'll put amount. Those are the two things this word many emphasizes. Now, I'm highlighting this for a reason, because in verse 2, we're going to see a stark contrast. This word but right here is going to note a contrast, a difference between what's said in verse 2 and what's said in verse 1. So we have God speaking to the fathers, the patriarchs of the faith, Israel as a nation. He spoke by the prophets, okay? So the many ways here that we saw specifically and mainly is by the prophets. That's not the only way God spoke, okay? But, God does speak what seems to be primarily through the prophets, which, if you start in the beginning, technically Abel's one of the first prophets of God, speaking even from the ground. His blood speaks righteous judgment against Cain. And then you get, all the way down the line, you get to Enoch, you get to Noah, you get to Abraham. We don't think about this. We usually start with, when it comes to the prophets, we think of usually only Moses as one of the first, when technically, there's a number of prophets before Moses. So when it says, that God spoke many times in many ways through the prophets or by the prophets, right? That doesn't limit how God speaks as only being through the prophets, but there is actually a variety of times and ways in which God spoke through the prophets, but also apart from the prophets. God speaks through dreams, God speaks through visions, okay? So when you read the Bible, here's tip number 3. What we need to do here is make sense of what it means for God to speak by the prophets, right? What it means that these prophets were the way that God communicated his word to humanity at different times, but also why the author is, focusing in on the specific way God spoke, which is by the prophets. He doesn't address the dreams or the visions or, Balaam was spoken to by God through a donkey. You have all these different ways that God speaks through the messengers and angels that are sent, but he's focusing in on the prophets, right? So when you read the Bible, ask questions like, why are the prophets emphasized? And then what I want you to do is think through anywhere in the scriptures you can recall where God actually spoke to the fathers of the faith by any prophet. Whether it's Samuel, whether it's Elijah, whether it's Moses, whether it's, The list goes on and on. Elisha. What we need to think about is, where did God speak to the people by the prophets? I want to kind of front load all of that to the front of my mind as I think about what's about to be said here, okay? So when you read the Bible, do your best to, engage your mind to think through all the different instances or occurrences that immediately come to mind where you can think of God speaking to the fathers by the prophets. Now we get to verse 2, where it says, but, and this word but notes a transition. Or at least in this case, it's going to be a contrast. So the word but is going to take what was said in verse 1 and note a difference between what's said in verse 2 and what's said in verse 1. There's something being compared and contrasted. When you have a comparison, you have similarities being drawn. When you have a contrast, you have differences being emphasized. So, but in these last days, okay, remember how I said to pay attention to time markers? So in verse 1, we have a long ago, right? In verse 2, we have another time marker, these last days. What I want to do when I read the Bible is take note of the fact that there are 2 times in 2 verses where a reference of time is made. This is a general long ago, like throughout the history of humanity, and now in verse 2, we have a little more specific time frame. These last days. Now it's on us to ask the question, when you read the Bible, figure out what these last days means. One way you might do that is by look at how the Greek phrase these last days, or that idea of last days, is often used in the New Testament, and then compare and contrast those different occurrences, right? This is what it means to do a word or phrase study, is I'm looking throughout the rest of the New Testament and even into the Old Testament to see where I've seen the concept of the last days to make sense of, what time frame the author is specifically referencing. But I can also keep reading on to make sense of what these last days are. He'll give me hints. For instance, in these last days, God has spoken to us by his Son, okay? So what I want you to notice is, again, there's a contrast between the Son of God that he's spoken through in these last days and the prophets he's spoken through at many times in many ways long ago, right? So what we need to do is figure out what's being contrasted in verse 1 and 2, and maybe list that out. So for instance, I see the Son of God being contrasted with the prophets. Not that they're at odds, but the Son is going to be communicated as supremely better. He's a perfect revelation of the Father. He's a perfect word from the Father, right? The prophets in the long ago days were not a perfect revelation of the Father. They weren't the very essence of God in human flesh. The Son is very different. So what we have being contrasted, and this is what I want you to think about when you read the Bible. When you see the word but and you know there's a contrast being drawn, list out what's being contrasted. Right, here we have number 1, let's put the Son and the prophets, right? That's a clear, a very obvious contrast being drawn. So what we need to ask is, in what ways are they different? In what ways are they similar? Let's answer that, right? In what ways are they similar? Well, these are both ways in which God speaks to humanity, right? In what ways they're different is the time frame attached to them. Long ago, the prophets were, God's main way of communicating to humanity. In these last days, that's a different time frame. His Son is, right? He's spoken to us by his Son, whom he is appointed the heir of all things, through whom he also created the world. So now we transition a little bit and we start to get a description of this Son. And I'm going to highlight it in yellow, actually. Okay, what I want you to note when you read the Bible is anytime there's a list of descriptions or a list of activities or a list of actions or adjectives or people, take note of it. So we have a list here of attributes of this Son. He's appointed as the heir of all things, right? He's the one through whom the Father created the world. Verse 3 will go on, he's the radiance of the glory of God. He's the exact imprint of his nature. So we can cheat a little bit and read ahead and know that there's a list developing. The author's starting to paint a picture of who this son is, and he didn't really do that with the prophets or the way God spoke through the prophets in the long ago days, in the many times and many ways God spoke. So when you see something like that and you go, the author's giving a lot of attention to this son, it's on us to figure out why. Okay? So ask, why is the son getting all this attention and all this airtime? Why is the spotlight on him for so long? That might communicate to us what the author is mainly trying to get across, right? That might be part of how we make sense of what the author is saying in contrast between the prophets and the son, okay? So what we're going to do in the next Bible study walkthrough is we're going to continue to trace this out, but I hope that you at least, I didn't really finish the contrast thing, so let's also do this. Number 2, not just the son and the prophets, but we have the time frames. Those are differences being drawn. Those are two things being compared, 2 different seasons in human history, right? Or how about this? Who God is speaking to in the long ago days by the prophets. Well, it's to the fathers. Who God's speaking to now in these last days by the Son is us, the author says. So the audience is different, right? So when you think about when you see a contrast being drawn, list out the similarities for sure if there's any, but also list out the clear, obvious differences that will help you make sense of a biblical text. Because if he's drawing a contrast, that's going to be part of his main point. And our job is to figure out the main idea, the main point of a biblical text. All right? So I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough where we continue through Hebrews chapter 1.